You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 356, The Federalist Papers and New York. Last week, we covered the ratification of the Constitution by the largest state, Virginia, bringing the total to 10 states. The only other really critical state remaining was New York. The Empire State was skeptical of the new Constitution before it was even written. Governor George Clinton had dominated New York politics for years. He'd served as governor since 1777, when the position was first established. Before that, he served in New York's General Assembly, the Continental Congress, and as a general in the Continental Army. He was extremely popular and was even elected both governor and lieutenant governor in his first election in 1777. Clinton was also a political opponent of Alexander Hamilton. The newcomer to New York politics inherited Clinton's wrath by marriage. While Hamilton and Clinton had gotten along pretty well as fellow Continental officers during the war, Hamilton had married the daughter of Philip Schuyler, who was probably Clinton's strongest political opponent in earlier times. Hamilton took up many of the same political causes that Schuyler had advocated once Hamilton began serving in the New York State Legislature and the Confederation Congress. When Hamilton introduced a motion to send 5 delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1777, Clinton was skeptical. The governor had his supporters in the legislature reduce the number of delegates to 3, then sent Hamilton along with 2 strong ideological opponents of a stronger federal government, State Senator Abraham Yates and the mayor of Albany, John Lansing. These 2 delegates assured that New York would oppose Hamilton's vision of a much more powerful federal government. Both of these men ended up leaving the convention early to inform Clinton about what was happening. Their absence meant that New York could not vote on anything else at the convention, since a state vote required at least 2 delegates. Hamilton would be the only New York delegate to sign the Constitution. Clinton found his base of political power in the small yeoman farmers of upstate New York. These were opposed to the merchants in the city and the large landowning aristocratic leaders like Philip Schuyler. Clinton also acted as a moderate. Keeping in mind his political base, he tried to put forward moderate policies that would benefit everyone. New York had avoided much of the strife and economic difficulties that New England experienced in the post-war era. This had allowed him to continue serving as a popular 4-term governor by 1788. This isn't to say New York didn't have its issues. In 1786, Clinton had called out the militia to help suppress some spillover from Shays' Rebellion. And in 1788, while we're in the middle of this debate over ratification, Clinton had to call out the militia again. This time it was for the Doctors' Riot in New York City. Now, the Doctors' Riot had nothing to do with the Constitution or national politics, but it's an interesting story that happened at this time, so I suppose I should give it a quick mention. There is some question about the story that sparked the riot. While it seems to have some basis in fact, parts of it may have been made up or exaggerated. In any event, I'll give you the story, and you can decide. In April of 1788, a group of boys were playing near a lab at a New York hospital and saw a medical student dissecting a woman. The boys wondered who the woman was, and the student responded in a particularly New York way by telling him that the body was "Yo Mama." By coincidence, one of the boys had recently lost his mother, so he went home to tell his father. His father then picked up a shovel and dug up his wife's grave. It was empty. Now, there's no evidence that the body the med student was working on was actually the same person. Medical students had for years been digging up fresh graves for dissection. More accurately, they would often pay grave robbers for bringing them fresh bodies, no questions asked. And typically, robbers would take bodies from the Negro burying ground or potter's field for poor people, which didn't seem to raise as much fuss, at least not among people who had the power to do anything about it. But by February 1788, a newspaper reported that a white woman's body had been stolen from Trinity Churchyard. So when this event happened in April, New Yorkers were already primed for action. A mob quickly formed and stormed the hospital, causing doctors and medical students to flee. The mob found 3 bodies, one boiling in a kettle to remove flesh from the bones, and 2 others that were cut up with body parts hanging around the room. The mob destroyed the rooms and took much of the specimens into the street, which they burned in a large fire. There was some effort to throw a couple of medical students who had been captured into the fire as well, but the sheriff arrived and removed them to jail for their own protection. After discussing the matter further that evening, probably in taverns, many members of the public decided that more action was needed. A mob of hundreds of people surrounded Columbia College. Alexander Hamilton appeared and tried to calm the mob. They pushed him aside and entered the areas where they thought they might find bodies or body parts. Now, in this case, the staff had managed to remove anything the night before. Still unhappy, the mob, which grew to about 5,000, broke into the houses of several doctors, again searching for bodies. They finally ended up back at the jail, demanding access to the medical students who had been arrested the night before. The prisoners had to fend off attacks with rocks and bricks. When one of the rioters got inside the jail, the guards killed him, which only angered the rioters even more. Several more prominent leaders tried to quell the violence. John Jay was hit in the head with a rock. The former general, Baron von Steuben, was hit with a brick as well. Hundreds of militia rushed to the jail. Clinton had sent them with strict orders not to fire on the mob. However, when the mob attacked the militia ended up firing back in self-defense. At least 3 rioters and 3 militiamen were killed in the fight, although some observers put the death count at closer to 20. In the following days, many doctors published ads proclaiming that they had never taken a body from anywhere in the city. Now, this, of course, ignored the fact that Potter's Field and the Negro burying ground were outside city limits. Vigilantes formed dead guardmen, armed groups that patrolled cemeteries at night to prevent grave robbing. A grand jury investigated the riots, but never resulted in any convictions. Now, the issue seemed to subside after that, and there's no evidence that this had any impact on the debates over ratification, although the riots took place only a week or two before the election of delegates to New York's ratifying convention. Despite the occasional riot, New York was doing pretty well, and things were pretty stable, especially when compared to New England. Even so, New York had political divisions similar to what we've seen in other states. The merchant class, particularly in New York City, favored the new Constitution, which they believed would improve trade and establish more economic stability across the continent. At the same time, farmers throughout the state opposed the Constitution. One reason New York was doing so well was because of the massive revenues from tariffs collected in New York City. This allowed the state to keep other taxes lower, meaning that small farmers were not hit as hard with property taxes. The new Constitution would give those tariff revenues to the federal government, meaning the state would likely have to increase property taxes, hitting hard those struggling farmers. New York had also confiscated a large amount of land from Loyalists. The new Constitution was seen as a way for these Loyalists to sue for the return of their property, pursuant to the Peace Treaty of 1783. As I said, Governor Clinton's political base rested with these farmers who opposed the new Constitution, so he was in no hurry to get behind it. He also did not come out forcefully against it, though. In the fall of 1787, the state assembly was not in session, and Governor Clinton saw no reason to call a special session to consider the Constitution. 2 New York delegates who had opposed Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention, Yates and Lansing, began writing articles and essays in opposition to the Constitution, arguing that it would destroy New York's sovereignty. Now, we've seen many of the arguments made in other states. The convention in Philadelphia had exceeded its authority, the Constitution included no Bill of Rights, and so on. One very local objection was the issue of giving up revenue from the Port of New York. Opponents also seized on the Senate, in particular, as being an aristocratic body. Of course, the Federalists fought for ratification in the state. Leading the fight was Alexander Hamilton. As early as July of 1787, and this is 2 months before the convention in Philadelphia was even over, Hamilton had published an anonymous article criticizing the governor's lack of support for the convention. He argued the governor was more concerned about protecting his own power than the national good. Now, beginning in late October, about a month after the Philadelphia Convention had ended, Hamilton published his first essay in favor of ratification and extolling the virtues of the new Constitution. Now, Hamilton hoped to recruit others to help write a series of articles explaining the benefits of the Constitution and encouraging New Yorkers to support its ratification. The first man he sought for help was fellow New Yorker John Jay. Hamilton also reached out to William Duer, another New York finance guy. Dewar wrote one or two essays. Hamilton, however, did not consider his work up to the task and removed him from the project. Hamilton also reached out to Gouverneur Morris. Morris had been a Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitution, but he had lived most of his life in New York and had recently purchased a new home in the state. Morris, however, was too busy to get involved in the project. In the end, Hamilton turned out of state to James Madison of Virginia. Madison was actually staying in New York at the time, where he was overseeing the constitutional process before the Confederation Congress. Hamilton, Jay, and Madison worked out a plan to divide the essays into their areas of expertise. Jay, who had served as a diplomat in Europe and negotiated several treaties, focused on foreign relations. Madison had long studied the history of ancient republics. Many of his essays focused on the historical reasons for why the Constitution had certain features. The author of the Virginia Plan also focused on the many checks and balances in the new government and how they would prevent factions that were prevalent in many state governments from being able to take control of federal power. Hamilton focused more on the executive branch, the judiciary, as well as taxation and the military. It was a common practice at the time for both advocates and opponents to publish their essays under pseudonyms, usually drawn from ancient Rome. Anti-Federalists in New York commonly published under the name Brutus or Cato. Some historians suspect that Governor Clinton himself was Cato. Initially, Hamilton had begun publishing simply as, quote, a citizen of New York. However, once Madison joined the team from Virginia, that would no longer work. The team chose to publish under the pseudonym Publius, after Publius Valerius Poplicola. He was one of the leaders of the effort to overthrow the Roman monarchy and helped form the Roman Republic around 500 BC. Jay ended up only writing a few essays. He wrote 4 of the first 5, but then he fell sick in early December and could not really contribute over the next few critical months. Some authors say that Jay was absent because he was injured in the doctors' riots. In truth, Jay had a flare-up of rheumatism that prevented more activity. He did write one more essay toward the end of the series, and he also wrote a very critical essay in April that wasn't published as part of the Federalist Papers, but which had a major effect on the elections for the convention. Hamilton wrote a majority of the Federalist Papers, with 51 credited to him. 29 were to Madison, and another 16 essays are in dispute, with many scholars arguing that they were jointly written by both Madison and Hamilton. Since all of them were published anonymously, there's no clear record on that point. They were published first as individual essays in New York papers. Then, the first volume of essays was published as a book in March of 1788, containing the first 36 essays. A second volume at the end of May included essays 37 through 77, and there were also an additional essays 78 through 85, which were published for the first time in that volume, having never been published in newspapers before that. Now, these were influential in explaining the benefits of the new Constitution and have been used by constitutional scholars ever since. But it's not really clear how much of an impact they had on the New York voters. Governor Clinton did not call for a special session in the fall of 1787. Instead, he waited until the regular opening of a new session in January of 1788. He sent the legislature not only the Constitution, but also the letters he had received from Yates and Lansing, explaining why they had left the convention early and including all of their criticisms. Clinton did not say anything for or against the Constitution at the time, but simply handed it over to the legislature. For several weeks, advocates were concerned that the legislature might not even call a convention at all. There were several close votes on how to characterize the convention, but in the end, the legislators overwhelmingly agreed that this was a decision for the people and that it would be an abuse of their power not to call a convention at all. They voted in February to hold elections 2 months later, in late April and early May. This was the same time that regular legislative elections were held. They also opened the election to all adult free white males, eliminating the property requirement that existed for electing legislators. The convention would take place in Poughkeepsie, beginning on June 17th. New York had 2 pretty well-organized political parties, even if they didn't call themselves by names and formal organization. They were centered around politicians, with one faction backing Governor Clinton and the other centered around Schuyler and Hamilton. Those in favor were called the Federalists. Those opposed sometimes called themselves the Anti-Federalists, but in New York they also started calling themselves by the name Republicans. There were 12 newspapers in New York State, all of which were run by Federalists. Only one newspaper printed a substantial number of Anti-Federalist articles. The Anti-Federalists published their own pamphlets, which they had to distribute on their own statewide. Because of the highly partisan nature of the debate, when the delegate votes were released in late May, there were 46 Anti-Federalist delegates and only 19 Federalists. All of the Federalist delegates came from New York City and the surrounding counties. The rest of the state voted overwhelmingly Anti-Federalist. The Federalists put their hopes in the fact that other states were likely to bring the Constitution into effect without New York. That would mean the question would turn from keeping the Confederation versus the new federal government into a debate more around there's going to be a new government, is New York going to be in or out? New York would have to choose to join the new union or not. The Confederation would be dead. The Federalists therefore hoped to draw out the convention in order to buy more time for news from other states to arrive. And this actually seemed to work. When the convention began, there were still only 8 states which had ratified. On June 24th, about a week into the convention, they learned that New Hampshire had become the 9th state to ratify, thus bringing the Constitution into effect. A week later, on July 2nd, the delegates learned of Virginia's ratification. The news of Virginia's ratification, just before Independence Day, had varied reactions. The Anti-Federalists saw this new Constitution as a threat to their liberty and independence. On July 4th, a group of Anti-Federalists in Albany held a public burning of the Constitution. In response, the Federalists held a parade celebrating the Constitution that evening. In response to the parade, the Anti-Federalists formed a mob, armed with clubs, stones, and bayonets, to stop that parade. Now, these were not just local thugs. Yates and Lansing were among those in the Anti-Federalist mob. Both sides had been drinking heavily. The Federalists outnumbered the Anti-Federalists, who retreated to a nearby house. The Federalists then besieged the house for some time before the defenders surrendered and were arrested. The riots resulted in about 18 seriously injured and 1 man allegedly killed by a bayonet. Despite the violence, work at the convention continued. Word of Virginia's ratification began to divide the Anti-Federalist majority at the convention. As we saw in Virginia, the debate at the convention turned from a yes or no vote on the Constitution to one of either voting for ratification or voting for an alternative with lots of amendments to make the new government more acceptable. New York did not want to be outside of the Union, especially with a hostile British army on its northern border in Quebec. New Yorkers recognized the continued need for participation in the Union. There was also the issue of whether New York City would remain the seat for the new federal government. Obviously, if New York refused to join the Union, Congress would be moving to another state. The convention came up with a whole range of amendments to the Constitution. They also voted to send a circular letter to the other states calling for a second convention to consider these amendments. Like other states that we've discussed, New York wanted a Bill of Rights as well as a whole range of other more substantive changes. Then the debates turned to whether ratification would be unconditional or conditional to these amendments. Lansing proposed a vote on a conditional ratification. In response, Federalists argued that without an unconditional ratification, New York would have no say in writing any amendments since it would not join the Union until after they passed. It would be much better to have New York participate in the amendment process as part of the Union. Federalists also raised the argument that if the convention refused to ratify, that New York City and its surrounding counties might end up seceding from the state of New York and join the United States on their own. On July 23rd, the delegates broke the fighting when several Anti-Federalists agreed to change their proposal to vote for ratification on express condition of the adoption of amendments to in full confidence that the amendments would be adopted. This made the vote for ratification unconditional and allowed New York to join the new government. On July 23rd, the convention voted 31 to 29 in favor of the new wording, despite the opposition of Governor Clinton and other leaders like Yates and Lansing. 3 days later, the delegates voted 30 to 27 to finalize ratification. New York would become the 11th state to join the Union. Next week, the Confederation Congress begins the process of establishing the new federal government. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe, and 10crucialdays.org. I also want to thank Penny Simmons for a one-time gift via PayPal. I really appreciate everyone who helps to support this show. This week we covered New York's ratification. For the Anti-Federalists, this really came down to poor timing and strategy. The only reason New York ended up voting in favor of ratification was because it became clear that the U.S. was moving forward under the new Constitution, with or without them. They were put in this predicament because they had debated the ratification so late. The convention was 9 months after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia had completed its work. If Governor Clinton had called an early session of the legislature and held a convention in the first couple of months of 1788, I'm pretty sure New York would have rejected the Constitution. Its decision probably also would have convinced Virginia and several other states to hold back as well. Now, this doesn't mean they would have killed the Constitution forever, but New York probably could have gotten its way to demand a second constitutional convention to consider all the amendments that various states had proposed before the new federal government went into effect. This probably would have led to a pretty different constitution from the one we have today. But the Constitution probably still would have happened at some point. No one was particularly happy with the Articles of Confederation. Clinton and the Anti-Federalists believed that they would increase their chances of defeating the Constitution by slowing down the process. In hindsight, this was completely wrong. Clinton was correct that there was an initial enthusiasm for the Constitution in the fall of 1787 that would begin to wane over time, but he didn't count on all the other states moving so quickly that New York had to ratify or be left behind. This raises the question, why did states that were opposed ratify anyway? Well, as I said, a big part of it was the fear of being left out. There were obviously going to be a bunch of big issues to settle when the first Congress met, including the Bill of Rights. If they wanted to have a say in that, they had to ratify first. And there was also a matter of trust. After Virginia's ratification especially, everyone expected George Washington to become the first president. He was highly respected. Governor Clinton considered Washington to be a friend. Also, enacting some Bill of Rights seemed pretty easy. So many states had already demanded one, and it wasn't like anyone was opposed to free speech or due process. Those who had rejected consideration of the Bill of Rights, people like James Madison, simply argued that one was unnecessary since the limited powers under the Constitution would never allow the federal government to infringe on such rights anyway. Federalists, like Madison, did not object to the substance of the Bill of Rights. They just didn't want it used as an excuse to slow down the ratification process. With so much to cover in this episode, between two riots and the Federalist Papers, I didn't get into a very deep discussion about the convention itself. I don't mind this because so many of the arguments that we hear at the New York Convention are ones we've already encountered at earlier conventions. That said, if you are interested in the details, please look at the links on my blog to other sources for this information. I also didn't really dive deeply into the substance of the Federalist Papers. I probably could make more than 20 episodes on that subject in and of itself. The Federalist Papers go into incredible detail explaining the thought process of those who wrote the Constitution and why they think its provisions make the most sense. Anyone who's studied political science or constitutional law has made great use of this source over many, many years. I decided to move along without covering the substance of them, since the discussion would be more a matter of political philosophy than history. I'd love to do a deeper dive into them, but I decided really I couldn't do them justice here without spending many more months than I would like. Other presenters have probably done a better job than I could anyway, and I want to move on to the actual establishment of the federal government. My book recommendation this week is The 11th Pillar, New York State and the Federal Constitution by Linda Grant DePaul. This book focuses on the ratification debate in New York in 1788. It's an older book, first published in 1966, and it may be hard to find a physical copy of it these days, but there is a Kindle version of the book available. There's also a borrow-only copy on archive.org. Now, one interesting thing about this book is that it did come before the huge ratification project at the University of Wisconsin got off the ground, so it's not relying on those sources. It is kind of an independent source. The author, Linda Grant DePaul, is a professor emeritus of history from George Washington University. Before she retired, which was quite some time ago, I actually took several of her history courses when I was an undergrad there, including her class on the American Revolution. I recently had the opportunity to speak with Professor DePaul again about one of her more recent books, and I'm going to be releasing a recording of that discussion soon. But if you want a book that focuses on New York's ratification, get The 11th Pillar, New York State and the Federal Constitution by Linda Grant DePaul. My online recommendation is a YouTube video called The Struggle for Ratification, New York's Role in Shaping the U.S. Constitution. This video was produced by the Historical Society of the New York Courts and includes a nearly 2-hour discussion with John Kaminsky and Richard Leffer, who are lead editors of the Ratification Project at the University of Wisconsin that I've referenced so many times. Also in the discussion are Jack Rakoff, who's a known expert on James Madison, and Michael Klarman, another history professor and author of the book The Framers' Coup, which I recommended several weeks ago. The talk is hosted by New York Judge Albert Rosenblatt. It's a great discussion by some of the men who are top experts on the subject of ratification. My question this week comes from Nick Carlock, who asks, what did the British generals, like Howe, Clinton, Gage, and etc., and Parliament thought of George Washington's resignation as commander-in-chief, giving up power after winning the Revolutionary War? Well, Nick, we've all heard stories about King George III upon hearing that Washington stepped down from the army and returned to his farm after winning the Revolution, commenting that, if true, he would be the greatest man in the world. And we only know that response from this private conversation because the king was having a conversation with a portrait artist who later told the story to others. There was no public statement on the matter. And I really haven't found any other public statements on the matter either from anyone in any position in Great Britain. By the end of 1783, Thomas Gage was retired and in poor health. William Howe was serving on the King's Privy Council. Henry Clinton was in Parliament and involved in an all-out PR war with Cornwallis over blame for the loss of the southern colonies. As far as I can tell, none of these top generals had much of anything to say about Washington's decision to step down and retire. Now, that said, Washington's decision probably did have an impact on how these men and other top British leaders thought about government more generally. The conventional wisdom in the 18th century in Britain and Europe was that a king was necessary for the stability of any government. Human nature is such that men who accumulate power will use their power to accumulate even more power, causing conflicts with other leaders and leading to regular civil wars or other acts that can disturb the good order. By having a king who serves for life and with an automatic successor, there's no way for anyone to maneuver themselves into that top job. The way that British leaders rose in power was through actions that gained the favor of the king and led to promotion. Cornwallis probably became the most politically powerful general from the Revolution, rising to Viceroy of India. Even in that role, though, he served at the pleasure of the king and his ministers. He was not going to try to get out of line to gain even more power. If a leader tried to replace the king himself, that pretty much guaranteed war and anarchy until the king could be restored. The example of this for all the people living at the time was Oliver Cromwell, who overthrew King Charles I until his death and restoration of the crown under King Charles II. If British leaders were looking for a precedent for what Washington was doing, it was probably Cromwell, a successful military leader who took his military prowess to mean he was better than the king himself and should replace him. Why would someone challenge the king if they did not want to replace the king? Washington, however, was part of a movement based on the idea that government could be run without a king, that the people, electing their own civilian leaders, could choose a government based on policies and principles rather than military force. Given our understanding of government today, it's hard to understand just how radical an idea this idea was at the time. Washington led the necessary military force to make that dream a reality, then stepped back to allow it to happen, allowing popular elections and the people's own choices to assign a leader who would also willingly step down when the time arose. Most British leaders assumed that the American experiment would eventually fall into anarchy, as the people could not remain united without a king. 2.5 centuries have proven them wrong. While the United States has occasionally relied on a strong man to get through a crisis, it has always returned power to civilian elected leaders. It is up to each generation to keep that principle alive. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.